For 12 years, Clara Hayes brought life into the world with hands that never trembled, even during the most difficult births. The enslaved women of Whitmore Plantation trusted her completely, whispering their fears and secrets as she guided their children into the harsh reality of bondage. But in November 1843, those trusted hands would deliver something far different than new life. Master Richard Whitmore would learn too late that the woman he dismissed as simple property possessed both the knowledge and the ruthlessness to end his existence as efficiently as she had begun so many others. His last conscious thought, as soil filled his mouth in the darkness of his own grave, would be the bitter recognition that he had always underestimated the woman who knew every secret his household held. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. But Clara's knowledge extended far beyond the art of childbirth. What the Whitmore family never discovered was that she could read and write, skills taught to her in secret by her mother before being sold away when Clara was just 9 years old. Those abilities transformed her from a simple midwife into something far more dangerous, a woman who could read the medical journals Master Whitmore kept locked in his study, who understood the properties of every plant growing in the plantation gardens, and who knew exactly which substances could stop a heart while leaving no trace that any crime had been committed. The same hands that had memorized every page of those stolen medical texts would soon put that forbidden knowledge to its final, terrible use. The year was 1843, and the Whitmore Plantation stretched across 1,500 acres of fertile Kentucky bottomland, where tobacco plants grew tall under summer skies, and winter brought frost that glittered on bare fields like scattered diamonds. The main house stood 3 stories high, its white columns gleaming in sunlight, a monument to prosperity built entirely on the backs of 63 enslaved souls who worked from dawn until darkness swallowed the horizon. Master Richard Whitmore had inherited this empire from his father just 5 years earlier, along with a reputation for being what neighboring plantation owners called a progressive master, which simply meant he preferred psychological cruelty to physical brutality, though he was perfectly willing to employ both when circumstances demanded. Clara Hayes had been born on this very land 32 years before that fateful November, her first breath drawn in the cramped quarters behind the big house where domestic slaves lived in conditions that would horrify even the most hardened observers. Her mother, Margaret, had been the plantation's head laundress, her hands perpetually raw and cracked from the harsh lye soap she used to scrub the Whitmore family's fine linens until they gleamed white as fresh snow. Margaret possessed something rare and dangerous for an enslaved woman. She could read, having been taught by a sympathetic Quaker woman during her childhood in Pennsylvania before being sold south to satisfy her original master's gambling debts. Those long nights in the laundry house, while other slaves sought what little rest they could manage, Margaret had taught her daughter the alphabet using charcoal on scraps of old fabric. She traced letters in the dim candlelight, whispering their sounds and meanings, while Clara's small fingers followed the movements with desperate concentration. By the time Clara reached 7 years old, she could read simple passages from the torn Bible pages Margaret had collected over years of careful theft from the main house. The education came with strict warnings that formed the foundation of Clara's understanding about survival in a world designed to crush people like her. "Never let them know what you understand, child," Margaret would whisper, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire that heated water for endless loads of washing. "They fear our minds more than they fear our bodies. The moment they know you can read, you become too dangerous to keep alive. You become a threat that must be eliminated." Those words proved prophetic when Clara was 9 years old, and Margaret made a fatal mistake. She had been caught reading a discarded newspaper in the kitchen, her lips moving slightly as she absorbed news from the outside world. Master Richard's father, the elder Whitmore, had her sold within 24 hours to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, a place where life expectancy for field workers rarely exceeded 5 years. Clara never saw her mother again, but she carried the gift of literacy like a blade hidden against her ribs, sharp and deadly, waiting for the moment when it could finally be drawn. The years that followed shaped Clara into something harder than the girl who had lost her mother. She was assigned to work in the main house under the supervision of Mistress Eleanor Whitmore, a thin woman with perpetually pursed lips, who believed that idle hands invited sin and made certain no hands under her supervision remained idle for even a moment. Clara scrubbed floors until her knees bled, polished silver until her reflection stared back at her from every gleaming surface, and learned to become invisible in the way that domestic slaves must master to survive. She moved through rooms like smoke, present but unnoticed, her eyes downcast, and her expression carefully neutral, even as she absorbed every conversation, every secret, every piece of information that might someday prove useful. When Clara turned 16, the plantation's elderly midwife, a woman named Ruth who had delivered babies for 40 years, recognized something in the quiet girl who assisted her during births. Perhaps it was the steadiness of Clara's hands when pulling a breeched infant from its mother's womb, or the calm intelligence in her eyes when Ruth explained the signs of complications that could kill both mother and child within minutes. Whatever Ruth saw, she began teaching Clara everything she knew about the dangerous art of bringing life into a world built on death. The education proved invaluable in ways Ruth never intended. Clara learned not just about birth, but about the human body's vulnerabilities, about pressure points and blood flow, about which herbs could ease pain and which could stop a heart. She learned about the plants growing wild in the plantation gardens and the woods beyond, memorizing their properties with the same careful attention she had once applied to learning letters. Foxglove could regulate an irregular heartbeat or stop it entirely depending on the dose. Hemlock caused paralysis and respiratory failure. Nightshade brought delirium and death. The knowledge accumulated like gold coins in a hidden purse, precious and dangerous, waiting for the day when it might purchase something more valuable than money. But it was Master Whitmore's library that completed Clara's transformation from midwife to something far more deadly. The master fancied himself a man of science and culture, collecting medical journals and anatomy texts that he studied while drinking brandy in his private sanctuary. He never locked the library door during the day, assuming that illiterate slaves posed no threat to his precious books. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Over the course of 5 years, Clara systematically read every medical text in that library, carefully replacing each volume exactly as she found it, her fingers tracing diagrams of human anatomy and her mind absorbing information about poisons, sedatives, and the various mechanisms through which life could be extinguished. She learned about digitalis extracted from foxglove, about how it affected the heart's rhythm. She studied the properties of laudanum, the opium-based tincture that genteel ladies used for everything from headaches to menstrual cramps, and discovered that sufficient doses could suppress breathing until it stopped entirely. She memorized the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, though she immediately discarded that option as too obvious, too easily detected by anyone with medical knowledge. What Clara sought was something that would appear natural, that would raise no suspicions, that would allow her to act when the time came without fear of discovery. The medical journals provided exactly what she needed, and she committed every relevant passage to memory with the precision of a scholar preparing for examinations that would determine not just academic success, but life or death itself. By 1843, Clara had delivered 247 babies on Whitmore Plantation, including 7 for Mistress Martha Whitmore, who had married Master Richard 3 years after his first wife died in childbirth. Martha was 20 years younger than her husband, a nervous woman with delicate features who seemed perpetually on the verge of tears. She treated the enslaved household staff with a distant kindness that was somehow worse than outright cruelty, as if acknowledging their humanity while doing nothing to alleviate their suffering somehow absolved her of complicity in their bondage. The other enslaved women on the plantation looked to Clara not just as a midwife, but as a source of wisdom and quiet strength in a world designed to break them. She had saved countless lives through her skill and knowledge, pulling babies from impossible positions, stopping hemorrhages that would have killed their mothers, and treating infections with poultices made from herbs she cultivated in a small garden behind the quarters. Her reputation extended beyond Whitmore Plantation to neighboring estates, where masters would sometimes loan her out for difficult births, collecting fees for her services, while Clara herself saw not a single cent of the money her expertise generated. But beneath Clara's calm exterior, beneath the gentle hands and soothing voice she employed during births, something cold and calculating had been growing for years. Every child she delivered into slavery, every mother she saved only to watch her return to brutal labor within days of giving birth, every tiny coffin she helped construct for infants who died before their first birthday, all of it fed a fury that she had learned to compress into something dense and patient. Clara understood that rage expressed openly meant death, or worse. But rage channeled carefully, rage combined with knowledge and planning, could become something truly dangerous. She had been preparing for years without fully understanding what she was preparing for, accumulating skills and information like a general gathering weapons before a war. All she needed was the right catalyst, the right moment when opportunity and necessity aligned perfectly. That moment would arrive on a humid October evening when Mistress Martha Whitmore's 8th pregnancy took a dangerous turn, and Clara's careful hands delivered more than just a child into the world. They delivered the secret that would seal Master Richard Whitmore's fate and transform a midwife into an executioner whose actions would be whispered about in slave quarters across 3 states. A cautionary tale for masters who underestimated the power of knowledge in hands they assumed were capable only of servitude. The autumn air carried the scent of tobacco, curing in the distant barns, as Clara made her way toward the main house that October evening, her midwife's bag clutched tightly against her side, its familiar weight a comfort born of years of practice. The enslaved field workers were returning from the tobacco fields as the plantation bell rang out across Whitmore's land, signaling the end of another back-breaking day. Clara walked past them with purpose, her worn shoes kicking up small clouds of dust from the path that connected the quarters to the main house. She had been summoned urgently an hour earlier by one of the house servants, who reported that Mistress Martha had begun labor unexpectedly, 3 weeks earlier than the midwife had calculated. Early births carried additional risks, and Clara's mind was already running through the complications she might face as she climbed the back stairs to the 2nd floor, where the Whitmore family's private chambers occupied the eastern wing of the house. The birthing room had been prepared according to Clara's specific instructions from earlier pregnancies. Clean linens covered the bed, basins of hot water steamed on a side table, and extra candles provided the bright light necessary for Clara to see clearly during the delicate work ahead. Mistress Martha lay propped against pillows, her face pale and slick with perspiration, her hands gripping the bedsheets with white-knuckled intensity. Master Richard stood near the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading daylight, a glass of brandy already in his hand, though the evening had barely begun. He turned as Clara entered, his cold blue eyes assessing her with the same detached evaluation he might give a piece of farm equipment. "She's been in labor for 2 hours," Richard said, his voice clipped and irritated, as if his wife's suffering was a personal inconvenience designed specifically to disrupt his evening routine. "I expect you to manage this situation quickly and quietly. We have dinner guests arriving at 8, and I will not have screaming disturbing the meal." The casual cruelty of the statement barely registered with Clara anymore. She had long since stopped being shocked by the ways wealthy white men viewed the women in their lives, whether enslaved or married, as objects to be controlled rather than human beings deserving of compassion. Clara moved to Martha's bedside with practiced efficiency, setting down her bag and beginning the careful examination that would tell her exactly how far the labor had progressed. Her hands, gentle but firm, pressed against Martha's swollen belly, feeling the position of the child within. What she discovered made her breath catch slightly, though she carefully kept her expression neutral. The baby was breeched, feet first rather than head down, a dangerous complication that could kill both mother and child, if not handled with extreme skill. This would be a long and difficult birth, one that would test every bit of knowledge Clara had accumulated over 16 years of bringing babies into the world. "Master Whitmore," Clara said quietly, keeping her eyes respectfully downcast, even as she delivered news she knew he wouldn't want to hear. "The baby isn't positioned correctly. This birth will take many hours, and Mistress Martha will need complete quiet and rest. I must ask that you postpone your dinner party until tomorrow." The silence that followed her words felt heavy with danger. Richard Whitmore was not a man accustomed to being told what to do by anyone, least of all by enslaved women who existed only to serve his convenience. "You will manage," Richard said finally, his voice dropping to a tone that carried unmistakable threat. "You will do whatever is necessary to ensure this birth happens quickly and quietly, or you will face consequences that will make you wish you had never been born. Do you understand me, Clara?" She nodded, her jaw clenched tight against the response she wanted to give. Instead, she turned her attention back to Martha, who had begun crying softly, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as another contraction racked her body. The hours that followed tested Clara's abilities to their absolute limit. She worked tirelessly, her hands moving with precision born of years of experience as she attempted to manually turn the baby into the correct position. Martha's screams filled the room despite Richard's orders for silence, and Clara could hear him pacing in the hallway outside, his heavy footsteps and angry muttering a constant reminder of the pressure under which she labored. The dinner guests arrived, and were entertained downstairs with increasingly strained excuses about Martha's temporary indisposition, while upstairs, Clara fought to save 2 lives that hung in precarious balance. It was nearly midnight when Clara finally succeeded in turning the baby. Her arms ached from the effort, and sweat dripped down her face despite the cool autumn air flowing through the open windows. Martha had long since exhausted herself with screaming, and now made only small whimpering sounds between contractions, her body too depleted to manage more vigorous expressions of pain. The actual delivery, when it finally came, happened quickly. Clara's experienced hands guided the infant's head through the birth canal, supporting the tiny body as it emerged slick with blood and vernix into the candle-lit room. The baby was a girl, small but apparently healthy, her lungs strong enough to produce the robust crying that announced her arrival into the world. Clara worked quickly, tying off and cutting the umbilical cord, then wrapping the infant in clean linen before placing her briefly on Martha's chest. The new mother's eyes were glazed with exhaustion, but she managed a weak smile as she looked at her daughter for the first time. Clara knew from experience that this moment of maternal bonding would be brief. Soon, Martha would hand the child over to a wet nurse, as wealthy women considered breastfeeding beneath their station, and the baby would be raised primarily by enslaved nursemaids, while her mother recovered her figure and returned to social obligations. But it was what came next that would change everything. Clara turned her attention to delivering the placenta, the final stage of birth that carried its own risks if not managed properly. She pressed carefully on Martha's abdomen, encouraging the afterbirth to separate from the uterine wall. When it finally emerged, Clara caught it in a basin as she always did, planning to examine it to ensure no fragments remained inside that could cause dangerous infections. What she saw made her freeze completely, her breath stopping in her throat as her mind struggled to process the impossible thing her eyes were showing her. Tangled in the bloody tissue of the placenta was a golden locket on a delicate chain, small enough that it must have been inside Martha's womb throughout the entire pregnancy. The locket itself was exquisitely crafted, clearly expensive, with intricate engravings covering its surface. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she reached into the basin and retrieved the piece of jewelry, wiping away blood to reveal its details more clearly. The engravings were floral patterns, roses and vines intertwined in a design she recognized immediately because she had seen it before, many times, around the neck of Richard Whitmore's first wife, Elizabeth, who had died 7 years earlier, under circumstances that had always seemed suspicious to those who paid attention to such things. Clara glanced quickly toward Martha, but the exhausted woman had already fallen into the deep sleep that often followed difficult births, her breathing slow and regular, completely unaware of what Clara had discovered. The midwife's mind raced as she turned the locket over in her hands, finding the tiny clasp that would open it. Her fingers worked the mechanism carefully, and the locket sprang open to reveal 2 miniature portraits painted on ivory. One showed Elizabeth Whitmore, her dark hair arranged in the elaborate style fashionable a decade earlier, her eyes serious and intelligent. The other portrait showed a man Clara didn't recognize, handsome and young, with kind eyes that seemed to look directly at the viewer with warmth and affection. On the inside of the locket's opposite panel, engraved in script so tiny Clara had to hold it close to the candlelight to read, were words that made her blood run cold. "To my beloved Elizabeth, may our love survive even death's separation. Forever yours, James Carlyle." April 1835. Clara's mind worked quickly, calculating dates and circumstances. Elizabeth Whitmore had married Richard in June 1835, just 2 months after this locket had been inscribed. She had died in December 1842, 7 years later, supposedly from complications of childbirth, though the baby had also died, and some whispered that neither death had been entirely natural. The implications crashed over Clara like waves against a shore. Elizabeth had been in love with another man when she married Richard Whitmore. The locket was evidence of that love, kept hidden close to her heart, perhaps literally close enough that she had somehow managed to swallow it before dying to prevent Richard from ever finding it. But how had it ended up inside Martha's womb? The answer came to Clara with sick certainty. Martha must have somehow found the locket after Elizabeth's death, perhaps hidden among her predecessor's belongings. In a moment of panic or desperation, she had hidden it in the only place she thought no one would ever look, inserting it into her own body where it had remained for months, pushed deeper with each pregnancy examination, until the birth had finally expelled it, along with the afterbirth. Clara's hands moved automatically, washing the locket clean and drying it carefully, while her mind raced through possible explanations and implications. If Richard discovered this evidence that his first wife had loved another man, that she had kept this token of her true affection hidden throughout their marriage, his rage would be apocalyptic. But more importantly, the locket raised questions about Elizabeth's death that had never been adequately answered. Had Richard discovered her secret? Had he killed her in a jealous fury? And if so, was Martha now in danger simply for having found this evidence? The door opened suddenly, and Richard Whitmore entered the birthing room, his earlier anger apparently forgotten in light of his daughter's arrival. He looked first at the sleeping infant in her bassinet, then at his unconscious wife, and finally at Clara, who had just managed to slip the locket into her apron pocket before he could see it. "Is everything satisfactory?" he asked, his tone suggesting he was inquiring about the results of a business transaction rather than the welfare of his wife and child. "Both mother and baby are healthy, Master Whitmore," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Mistress Martha needs rest, and the baby should be given to the wet nurse within the hour." Richard nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned to leave. But he paused at the door, looking back at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You did well tonight, Clara. I won't forget this." The words should have been a compliment, but something in his tone made them sound more like a threat, as if he were reminding her that he held power over every aspect of her existence, and that good behavior was expected, not rewarded. After Richard left, Clara stood alone in the birthing room with 2 sleeping patients and a secret that burned in her pocket like a hot coal. She knew with absolute certainty that she now possessed information dangerous enough to get her killed. Master Whitmore would stop at nothing to prevent the truth about his first wife from becoming known. If he ever discovered that Clara had found the locket, her life would be measured in hours rather than days. The knowledge transformed everything. Clara had spent years accumulating skills and information, preparing without knowing what she was preparing for. Now she knew. She would need to act carefully, deliberately, and soon, because women who knew too much about powerful men's secrets rarely lived long enough to share them. Clara finished cleaning the birthing room with meticulous attention to detail, her hands performing familiar tasks, while her mind worked through possibilities and dangers with the precision of a chess player calculating moves several turns ahead. She disposed of the bloody linens in the way she always did, carrying them down to the laundry house where they would be scrubbed clean by women whose hands never stopped working from dawn until long past sunset. The placenta and other biological remnants she wrapped carefully in cloth, planning to bury them in the garden behind the quarters as was customary, though now that garden would hold something far more valuable hidden among the roots of her medicinal herbs. The locket remained in her apron pocket, its slight weight a constant reminder of the danger she now carried. Clara made her way through the darkened plantation grounds, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked these paths countless times in all conditions. The slave quarters stood in neat rows behind the main house, small wooden structures that housed the domestic workers and skilled craftsmen whose proximity to the White family required them to be available at all hours. Clara's cabin was slightly larger than most, a recognition of her value as the plantation's midwife, though it still consisted of just one room with a dirt floor and walls that let in cold air during winter months. She entered her cabin and carefully barred the door, a precaution she rarely took, but tonight felt necessary. A single candle provided enough light for her to retrieve a small wooden box from its hiding place beneath the loose floorboard under her sleeping pallet. The box contained her most precious possessions, things she had accumulated over years of careful saving and strategic acquisition. A few coins she had earned from births on neighboring plantations where masters had occasionally given her small tips for successful deliveries. Several letters her mother had written before being sold away, their edges worn soft from countless readings. A small knife with a blade sharp enough to cut umbilical cords or, if necessary, other things that might require cutting. Clara added the locket to this collection, wrapping it first in a scrap of clean cloth to protect it from moisture. She would need to find a better hiding place eventually, somewhere the locket could remain concealed, even if her cabin was searched. But for tonight, this would suffice. As she replaced the floorboard and arranged her pallet to hide any sign of disturbance, Clara's mind continued working through the implications of her discovery and the actions she might need to take. The next morning arrived with the plantation bells harsh clanging, calling enslaved workers to another day of labor before the sun had fully risen above the horizon. Clara had slept poorly, her dreams troubled by images of Elizabeth Whitmore's painted face staring at her with accusing eyes, as if blaming Clara for uncovering secrets that had been meant to stay buried. She rose and dressed quickly, knowing that Mistress Martha would need care throughout her recovery, and that the new baby would require frequent attention to ensure she thrived during those critical first weeks of life. The main house bustled with activity as Clara entered through the kitchen door. House servants moved through their morning routines with practiced efficiency, preparing breakfast for the Whitmore family while managing the dozens of small tasks that kept the household running smoothly. Clara made her way upstairs to check on her patients, finding Martha awake but weak, her face still pale from the previous night's ordeal. The baby slept peacefully in her bassinet, apparently unbothered by her dramatic entrance into the world. "How are you feeling this morning, Mistress Martha?" Clara asked, beginning her examination with gentle hands that checked for signs of fever or excessive bleeding that might indicate complications. Martha managed a weak smile, though her eyes held a haunted quality that Clara recognized from other women who had survived difficult births. "Tired," Martha whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of screaming. "Everything hurts, and I feel like I've been trampled by horses." Clara nodded sympathetically, having heard similar descriptions countless times before. "That's entirely normal after what you went through," Clara assured her, preparing a cup of raspberry leaf tea mixed with small amounts of willow bark to help with pain and promote healing. "You'll feel stronger each day, but you must rest as much as possible for at least 2 weeks. Your body needs time to recover." As Clara helped Martha drink the tea, the bedroom door opened and Richard Whitmore entered, his presence immediately filling the room with tension. He barely glanced at his wife before turning his attention to Clara. "I need to speak with you privately," Richard said, his tone making it clear this was a command rather than a request. "Downstairs in my study, immediately." Clara's heart began racing, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. Had he somehow discovered that she had found the locket? Was this the moment when everything would unravel? She followed Richard down the stairs and through the house to his private study, a room lined with bookshelves containing the medical journals and anatomy texts she had secretly read over the years. Richard closed the door behind them and turned to face Clara, with an expression she couldn't quite read. For a long moment he simply stared at her, his cold blue eyes searching her face as if trying to read thoughts she kept carefully hidden. Finally he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "During the birth last night, did you notice anything unusual? Anything that seemed out of place or unexpected?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire, and Clara understood immediately that this was a test. Richard suspected something, though whether he knew specifically about the locket or simply sensed that secrets had been disturbed remained unclear. "The birth was difficult because of the baby's breech position," Clara replied carefully, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "But once I managed to turn her, everything proceeded as normal. Mistress Martha and the baby are both healthy, which is the best outcome we could have hoped for given the complications." Richard continued staring at her for several more seconds before finally nodding, though his expression remained suspicious. "My first wife died in childbirth 7 years ago," he said, apparently changing the subject, though Clara suspected this was all connected in ways he was about to make clear. "The midwife who attended her claimed complications, but I've always suspected incompetence or perhaps deliberate negligence." The accusation hung between them, an implicit threat about what happened to midwives who failed to meet Richard Whitmore's expectations or who knew things they shouldn't know. "I was not the midwife for that birth," Clara said quietly, which was true. Old Ruth had still been alive then, and she had attended Elizabeth Whitmore during what turned out to be her final hours. Ruth had never spoken about that night in detail, but Clara remembered the old woman's troubled expression in the days that followed, as if she had witnessed something that haunted her until her own death 3 years later. "No, you weren't," Richard agreed, moving to pour himself a glass of brandy from the crystal decanter on his desk, despite the early hour. "But you are the midwife now, and I need to be certain that you understand the importance of discretion. Births are private family matters, and anything you see or hear during your duties must remain absolutely confidential. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, recognizing the threat beneath his words. "I understand completely, Master Whitmore. I have always maintained strict confidentiality about all medical matters." Richard took a long drink from his glass, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "Good, because I would hate for there to be any misunderstandings about the consequences of loose tongues or prying eyes. Women who can't keep secrets have a tendency to meet unfortunate accidents on this plantation." The threat was now explicit, and Clara felt her fear transform into something colder and harder. This man had likely murdered his first wife, and he was now making it clear that he would do the same to anyone who threatened to expose his crimes. "There won't be any misunderstandings, Master Whitmore," Clara said, her voice steady even as she made a decision that would change everything. Richard Whitmore had just signed his own death warrant. He simply didn't know it yet. "You may rely on my complete discretion in all matters." Richard seemed satisfied with her response, and dismissed her with a wave of his hand, already turning his attention to papers on his desk, as if she had ceased to exist the moment she was no longer useful to him. Clara left the study and made her way back upstairs to check on Martha, her mind already beginning to formulate a plan. She had spent years accumulating knowledge about poisons and medicines, about the human body's vulnerabilities and the ways life could be ended while appearing entirely natural. Now she would put that knowledge to use in ways she had never quite imagined, but somehow had always been preparing for. Master Richard Whitmore would die, and his death would appear so completely natural that no one would ever suspect the gentle midwife whose hands had guided hundreds of babies into the world. The following weeks passed in a careful rhythm as Clara tended to Martha's recovery and the new baby's needs, while simultaneously planning murder with the meticulous attention to detail she normally reserved for difficult births. She began by reviewing everything she knew about Richard Whitmore's habits and health. The master suffered from occasional heart palpitations, a condition he treated with digitalis extract prescribed by a physician in Lexington. The medicine was kept in Richard's private chambers, measured out in careful doses that regulated his heartbeat without causing dangerous side effects. But digitalis was a treacherous substance, effective in small amounts, but deadly in slightly larger doses, and the symptoms of digitalis poisoning could easily be mistaken for a natural heart attack, especially in a man already known to have cardiac problems. Clara's plan took shape slowly, each element carefully considered and refined. She would need access to Richard's digitalis supply, which meant finding a way into his private chambers when he was absent and unlikely to return unexpectedly. She would need to increase the concentration of his medicine gradually, over several weeks, so that the symptoms would appear to develop naturally rather than suddenly, and she would need to ensure that when he finally died, she would have an unquestionable alibi that placed her far from the scene with witnesses who could testify to her presence elsewhere. The opportunity came sooner than Clara had expected. 3 weeks after the birth, Richard announced plans to travel to Lexington for business meetings that would keep him away from the plantation for 5 days. During his absence, Clara would have the run of the main house as she continued caring for Martha and the baby. More importantly, she would have access to his private chambers where the digitalis was stored. The night before Richard's departure, Clara lay awake in her cabin, reviewing every detail of her plan one final time, searching for flaws or oversights that might expose her. The morning Richard Whitmore departed for Lexington dawned gray and cold, with clouds hanging low over the plantation like a shroud. Clara watched from the kitchen window as he climbed into his carriage, his leather traveling bag secured on the roof, his expression already focused on whatever business matters occupied his thoughts. The moment the carriage disappeared down the long oak-lined drive that led away from the plantation, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. The game had begun, and there would be no turning back now. Everything she had learned, every skill she had acquired, every piece of forbidden knowledge she had memorized from stolen medical texts would now be put to use in service of a justice that the law would never provide. She waited until midday, when the house servants were occupied with their various duties, and Mistress Martha was napping in her chambers with the baby sleeping peacefully beside her. Clara moved through the house with the invisibility that came naturally to enslaved people who had learned to become like ghosts in the homes of their masters. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, where Richard's private chambers occupied the entire eastern wing, rooms that enslaved people only entered when specifically summoned to clean or deliver items. The door to his bedroom stood unlocked, an oversight born of arrogance. Richard Whitmore had never imagined that the people he owned might pose any threat to his person or property. The room smelled of tobacco and expensive cologne, masculine scents that Clara associated with power and cruelty. Richard's 4-poster bed dominated the space, its heavy curtains drawn back to reveal bedding that would need to be changed before his return. Clara moved quickly to the mahogany dresser where she knew he kept his medicines in a locked drawer. The lock was simple, designed more for privacy than security, and Clara had long ago learned how to pick such mechanisms using a thin piece of wire she carried in the pocket of her apron for exactly such purposes. Her mother had taught her this skill, one of many small rebellions that Margaret had passed down to her daughter before being sold away. The drawer opened with a soft click, revealing several glass bottles with handwritten labels indicating their contents and dosages. Clara found the digitalis immediately, a brown glass bottle containing perhaps 2 months' worth of the extract Richard used to control his heart palpitations. The prescription label instructed him to take 15 drops in water each morning, a dose carefully calculated by his physician to be therapeutic without being toxic. Clara withdrew the bottle and held it up to the light, examining the clear amber liquid within. This medicine kept Richard Whitmore alive, regulating the irregular beating of his heart. But with careful manipulation, it could just as easily kill him. Clara had brought with her a small vial of concentrated foxglove extract that she had prepared over several weeks using plants from her garden behind the quarters. Foxglove was the source of digitalis, and Clara had distilled it to a strength far beyond what any physician would prescribe. She carefully measured out an amount that would increase the concentration of Richard's medicine by approximately 20%. Not enough to kill him immediately, but sufficient to begin causing symptoms that would gradually worsen over time. She added the concentrated extract to his existing medicine, swirled the bottle gently to ensure even distribution, and replaced it exactly where she had found it. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. Over the following weeks, Clara would return to this drawer 3 more times, each time increasing the concentration further. Richard would begin experiencing worsening heart palpitations, shortness of breath, visual disturbances, and confusion. His physician, when summoned, would likely increase his digitalis dose in an attempt to control the symptoms, never suspecting that the medicine itself had been weaponized against him. Eventually, Richard's heart would simply stop, overwhelmed by the very substance meant to regulate it, and everyone would assume that his heart condition had finally claimed him despite the best efforts of modern medicine. Clara replaced the bottle, locked the drawer, and left the room exactly as she had found it. She returned to Martha's chambers to check on her patient, finding both mother and baby still sleeping peacefully. As Clara sat in the chair beside the bed, ostensibly keeping watch, but actually reviewing her plan for any flaws, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She was going to murder her master, violating every law of God and man according to the society that claimed to own her body and soul. Yet she felt no guilt, only a cold satisfaction that justice, however delayed and imperfect, would finally be served. Richard returned from Lexington 5 days later in good spirits, his business apparently concluded successfully. He barely acknowledged Clara's presence when she came to welcome him home and inform him that his wife and daughter continued to thrive. That evening, as was his custom, Richard took his digitalis dose before dinner, 15 drops measured carefully into a glass of water, never suspecting that those drops now contained a poison that would gradually accumulate in his system until it reached lethal levels. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway as he drank, her face expressionless, her hands steady as she held a tray of dishes meant for the dining room. The days that followed established a new rhythm. Clara continued her duties caring for Martha and the baby, while also attending to other births on the plantation and occasionally being loaned out to neighboring estates when difficult deliveries required her expertise. Every few days, when opportunities presented themselves, she would return to Richard's chambers and add more concentrated foxglove extract to his medicine. By the 3rd week, Richard had begun complaining of headaches and unusual tiredness, symptoms he attributed to the stress of managing the plantation's finances during a difficult economic period. By the 4th week, Richard's symptoms had progressed to include visual disturbances. He complained of seeing halos around lights and experiencing episodes where colors appeared unnaturally vivid or distorted. His physician was summoned from Lexington, and conducted a thorough examination that revealed irregular heartbeat and high pulse. The doctor increased Richard's digitalis dose, playing directly into Clara's plan, and prescribed bed rest for several days. Clara volunteered to prepare special meals for the master during his convalescence, nutritious broths and herbal teas that she claimed would support his recovery. Richard accepted these offerings without suspicion, never imagining that the hands feeding him were the same hands slowly poisoning him to death. During this period, Clara also began carefully spreading rumors among the other enslaved people about Richard's declining health. She mentioned in passing conversations that she feared the master's heart condition was worsening, that she had heard him complaining of symptoms that suggested serious deterioration. These rumors served two purposes. They would create a narrative that explained Richard's eventual death as the tragic but unsurprising result of a chronic condition, and they would establish Clara as someone who had been concerned about Richard's health, eliminating her from any possible suspicion when he finally died. 6 weeks after Clara had first tampered with Richard's medicine, his condition had deteriorated significantly. He experienced severe nausea and vomiting, extreme fatigue, and periods of confusion where he seemed unable to remember simple things or recognize people he had known for years. His physician returned and seemed genuinely puzzled by the progression of symptoms, unable to explain why Richard's condition continued worsening despite treatment. The doctor suggested that Richard might be suffering from some underlying illness beyond his heart problems and recommended consultation with specialists in Louisville. But Richard Whitmore would never make that journey to Louisville. Clara had been carefully monitoring his decline, watching for the signs that indicated his body was approaching the point where his heart could no longer compensate for the toxic levels of digitalis saturating his system. She knew from her medical readings that death would come suddenly when it came, the heart simply stopping as if a switch had been thrown. All she needed now was patience and one final opportunity to ensure that when Richard died, she would be far from the scene with witnesses who could confirm her whereabouts. That opportunity arrived on a cold November evening, exactly 7 weeks after Clara had begun her campaign of poisoning. One of the enslaved women from a neighboring plantation arrived at Whitmore's estate in desperate need of Clara's assistance. Her daughter had gone into labor unexpectedly, the baby coming far too early, and complications had developed that required immediate expert intervention. Clara was needed urgently, and Master Richard, despite his illness, granted permission for her to go, recognizing that the neighboring plantation owner would expect this courtesy and might reciprocate in the future. Before leaving, Clara made one final visit to Richard's chambers, ostensibly to check on his condition and ensure he had everything he needed during her absence. She found him in bed, his face pale and covered with perspiration, his breathing labored and irregular. The symptoms indicated that his heart was failing, that death could come at any moment. Clara felt no pity as she looked at this man who had threatened her life, who had likely murdered his first wife, who had built his wealth on the suffering of people he considered less than human. "I'm being called to assist with a birth on the Hampton plantation," Clara informed him, her voice professionally neutral. "Mistress Martha knows how to send for me if you need anything urgent, but I expect to be gone for several hours at minimum." Richard waved her away weakly, already focused inward on his body's distress signals. Clara left the room and the house, climbing into the small wagon that would transport her to the neighboring estate. The birth she attended that night was indeed complicated, requiring all of Clara's skill and attention. She worked for nearly 6 hours, finally delivering a tiny but viable infant girl whose early arrival had threatened both her own life and her mother's. Clara stayed with her patients until both were stable and resting comfortably, accepting the grateful thanks of the mother and the grudging appreciation of the Hampton plantation's overseer, who had been prepared for tragedy rather than triumph. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Clara finally returned to Whitmore Plantation, exhausted from hours of intense labor, but satisfied with the night's work. She was met at the quarters by one of the house servants, a young woman named Bess, whose expression immediately told Clara that something significant had happened during her absence. "Master Richard is dead," Bess whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and barely concealed relief. "His heart gave out around midnight. Mistress Martha found him when she went to check on him. The doctor's been sent for, but there's nothing to be done now except prepare for burial." Clara felt a wave of satisfaction wash through her, though she carefully schooled her features into an expression of appropriate shock and concern. Her alibi was perfect. She had been miles away, surrounded by witnesses, engaged in the holy work of bringing new life into the world, at the exact moment Richard Whitmore's life had ended. The official story, confirmed by Richard Whitmore's physician after a brief examination of the body, declared that the master had succumbed to heart failure, a tragic but unsurprising outcome for a man who had suffered from cardiac problems for years. The doctor expressed some puzzlement about the rapid deterioration of Richard's condition in recent weeks, but attributed it to the unpredictable nature of heart disease and the limitations of medical science in treating such conditions. No one suspected poisoning. No one questioned the gentle midwife who had been saving lives on a neighboring plantation when death claimed her master. Clara attended the funeral 3 days later, along with all the other enslaved people from Whitmore Plantation, her head bowed respectfully, her expression appropriately somber, while internally she felt a fierce triumph that she would never allow to show on her face. The weeks following Richard's death brought unexpected changes to the plantation. Mistress Martha, now a widow with substantial property and a newborn daughter, proved far less capable of managing the estate than her late husband had been. The overseer took advantage of her uncertainty to increase his own authority and his own cruelty, implementing harsher punishments for minor infractions and working the field slaves even harder than Richard had demanded. Clara watched these developments with growing concern, understanding that Richard's death had solved one problem while creating others that she had not anticipated. But Clara's plans extended beyond simply eliminating one cruel master. The locket remained hidden beneath her cabin's floorboard, physical evidence of Richard Whitmore's probable murder of his first wife. Clara had initially thought she might use this evidence to blackmail Richard or to expose his crimes publicly, but his death had rendered such plans unnecessary. Now the locket served a different purpose entirely. It was insurance, proof of the Whitmore family's darkest secrets that Clara could reveal if she was ever accused of any wrongdoing related to Richard's death. More importantly, the locket had given Clara something she had never truly possessed before: leverage. She began carefully approaching Mistress Martha during the quiet moments when they were alone in the nursery, planting seeds of information about things Clara had discovered over years of working in the household. She never mentioned the locket directly, but she made it clear that she knew secrets about Richard's first marriage, about financial irregularities in the plantation's accounts, about dealings with neighboring planters that would not bear close scrutiny. Martha, overwhelmed by sudden widowhood and the responsibilities of managing a large estate, began to understand that Clara was not simply a piece of property, but a person who possessed dangerous knowledge and considerable intelligence. The negotiations between them were never explicit, conducted instead through careful hints and oblique references that allowed both women to maintain plausible deniability about what was really being discussed. But gradually, an understanding emerged. Clara would continue serving as the plantation's midwife, and would maintain absolute discretion about everything she knew regarding the Whitmore family's secrets. In exchange, Martha would grant Clara something that enslaved people almost never received: freedom papers. The process took nearly 3 months to arrange, requiring consultations with lawyers and the creation of legal documents that would withstand scrutiny. Martha explained to anyone who asked that she was freeing Clara as a reward for years of faithful service and in recognition of her valuable skills as a midwife, skills that had saved both Martha's life and her daughter's during that difficult birth. The explanation was accepted without question by the white community. who saw such gestures as evidence of the benevolent paternalism they believed characterized Southern slavery at its best. On a spring morning in 1844, Clara Hayes walked away from Whitmore Plantation as a free woman, carrying manumission papers that legally established her status and a small sum of money that Martha had provided as final payment for services rendered. Clara also carried the golden locket, carefully wrapped and hidden in the bottom of her traveling bag, along with her mother's letters and the other precious items she had accumulated over years of bondage. She would keep the locket for the rest of her life, never selling it, despite periods of financial difficulty, preserving it as a reminder of how knowledge and patience could overcome even the most overwhelming power. Clara made her way north, traveling along routes established by the Underground Railroad, though she had no need of the secrecy such journeys usually required, since she carried legal papers proving her freedom. She settled eventually in Cincinnati, a city with a substantial free black community, where her skills as a midwife were desperately needed and highly valued. Over the following decades, Clara delivered hundreds more babies, but now she did so as a paid professional who could refuse clients and set her own terms. She never married, never had children of her own, but she became a beloved figure in Cincinnati's black community, known for her skill, her wisdom, and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her very presence. Clara rarely spoke about her years in slavery, and she never told anyone the full truth about Richard Whitmore's death. But sometimes, when attending particularly difficult births, where mothers' lives hung in precarious balance, she would remember those weeks of carefully calculated poisoning, the cold satisfaction of watching justice unfold according to her design. She had taken a life, violated laws both human and divine according to the teachings she had received, yet Clara felt no guilt about what she had done. Richard Whitmore had been a murderer and a tyrant who had built his wealth on suffering. His death had been neither random nor cruel, but rather a carefully measured response to crimes that would never have been punished through any legal system designed to protect men like him. The story of Clara Hayes might have ended there, another former slave who escaped to freedom and built a new life in the North. But Clara's legend grew in ways she could never have anticipated, spreading through the intricate networks of communication that connected enslaved communities across the South. The true circumstances of Richard Whitmore's death were never officially discovered, but enslaved people had their own ways of knowing things, their own methods of sharing information that bypassed white oversight. Whispers began circulating about the midwife who had delivered death to her master, about the woman whose gentle hands could end lives as skillfully as they began them. The legend transformed with each retelling, acquiring elements of the supernatural and the mythical. Some versions claimed that Clara had cursed Richard Whitmore, using African magic passed down through generations to stop his heart from a distance. Others insisted that she had poisoned him with knowledge stolen from his own books, turning his arrogance about enslaved people's illiteracy into the weapon that killed him. Still others spoke of her as an avenging angel, sent by God to punish masters who violated every principle of Christian charity while claiming divine sanction for their cruelty. These stories spread through slave quarters from Kentucky to Louisiana, from Virginia to Texas, carried by the invisible communication networks that allowed enslaved people to share news, warnings, and hope across vast distances. Clara became a symbol of resistance, proof that even the most powerless could find ways to fight back against their oppressors. Mothers whispered her name to daughters working in plantation kitchens, reminding them that knowledge was power and that patience could transform weakness into strength. Men facing brutal overseers drew courage from her example, understanding that resistance took many forms and that sometimes the quietest rebellion could be the most effective. In Cincinnati, Clara lived to the age of 78, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1889, surrounded by the children and grandchildren of women whose lives she had saved during births. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, black and white, who came to honor a woman they remembered as a healer, a teacher, and a pillar of the community. The golden locket was buried with her, its secrets finally laid to rest, along with the woman who had used them to purchase freedom with the currency of carefully measured revenge. But Clara's legend continued long after her death, evolving and adapting to serve the needs of each new generation that heard her story. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, activists rediscovered her tale and held her up as an early example of resistance against systemic oppression. Historians debated the accuracy of various versions of her story, arguing about which elements were factual and which had been embellished through decades of retelling. Medical ethicists examined her actions through modern frameworks, struggling to reconcile the healing profession's commitment to preserving life with Clara's decision to take one. The Whitmore Plantation itself fell into ruin during the Civil War, its fields reverting to wilderness, its grand house eventually collapsing under the weight of decades and neglect. The family cemetery where Richard Whitmore was buried became overgrown with weeds and brambles, his ornate marble headstone eventually toppling over and cracking into pieces that were slowly reclaimed by the earth. Local people reported strange occurrences in that abandoned graveyard, claiming to hear sounds of digging in the night, as if someone were perpetually excavating graves that would never yield their secrets. The true story of Clara Hayes, stripped of supernatural embellishments and mythical elements, remains a testament to the ways that knowledge and patience could overcome even the most overwhelming power differentials. She had been born into slavery, denied every right and dignity that free people took for granted, reduced to the legal status of property that could be bought and sold like livestock. Yet through the forbidden education her mother provided, and the skills she developed through years of careful observation and study, Clara had transformed herself into something her masters could never have imagined, a woman capable of planning and executing perfect murder disguised as natural death. Her story raises uncomfortable questions about justice, morality, and the ethics of resistance against systems designed to crush human dignity. Was Clara Hayes a murderer who violated fundamental moral principles by taking a life? Or was she an agent of justice who punished crimes that no legal system would ever address? The answer likely depends on one's perspective about the nature of slavery itself and the moral obligations of people trapped within inherently immoral systems. What remains indisputable is that Clara Hayes survived and ultimately escaped the institution that claimed to own her, using intelligence, knowledge, and ruthless calculation to secure a freedom that should have been her birthright. She lived another 45 years as a free woman, using her skills to save lives and build community, creating meaning and purpose from circumstances that had been designed to destroy both. The golden locket that had revealed Richard Whitmore's secrets and sealed his fate accompanied her to the grave, a symbol of how hidden knowledge could become the most powerful weapon of all. Before we end, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. To this day, in certain parts of Kentucky, old-timers still speak of the graveyard midwife who buried her master's secrets alive, the woman whose gentle hands brought life into the world and death to those who thought themselves untouchable. They say that on quiet nights, if you stand near the ruins of what was once Whitmore Plantation, you can still hear the sound of a shovel scraping against frozen earth, the rhythm steady and patient, as if someone is still digging, still searching, still remembering the night when justice was finally served by hands that had delivered it with the same skill and precision they had once used to deliver babies into a world built on suffering. Clara Hayes' story reminds us that history is written not just by the powerful, but also by those who found ways to resist power, who transformed their imposed limitations into unexpected strengths, and who understood that sometimes the longest path to freedom begins with a single careful step into darkness, trusting that knowledge and patience would eventually lead toward light.